Hi, welcome to another episode of When We Heal, the World Heals. I'm Trish Hay, your host. So delighted to have my guest today, Kim Rapach. She is a mental health, a mental wellness coach, actually. And I had the pleasure of meeting her recently in person and then learning about her podcast that she has called The Work of Warriors. So I started listening to that and then learning more about her story. And that led to me asking her to share with you all as well, because I know it helped me not to feel so alone. And that's the purpose of this whole podcast. So, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing with your podcast. And I too believe that when we heal, we share it with other people, and that's how we heal the world. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, when I heard you listening to your podcast, I heard you share your personal journey um, and very vulnerably. And that really helped me because I realized there were some things that I just really hadn't thought about and no one had ever spoken about before. So that's why I was like, oh, wow, another something else that I didn't even really think about. But if you're open to go ahead and share a bit about your childhood, what it was like growing up in your home and especially the topic that we are going to be discussing the most today, then that would be
Sure.
really great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll start first by just noting, because I think it's relevant. We'll come back to it probably, but
Mhm.
I'm a former therapist. I was a therapist for 20 years, and I now am a mental wellness coach. I work primarily with artists and entrepreneurs, the high achievers who are hustling their way through their trauma, because that's what I did. And that's how I became a therapist. And it was recognizing how my childhood had affected me so deeply in ways that I didn't even realize, that I even had to shift my career because I couldn't keep up with what was required as a therapist at that pace. And I realized I was over helping, which comes from my story, which I'll talk about. But again, thank you for having me. And in likes of sharing my story, essentially, I am a survivor of childhood domestic violence and sexual abuse by a man that my mom was married to. And I am a survivor of domestic violence with two intimate partners. I was 18 with one, and I think about 26 with the other. When I was 18, that boyfriend also sexually assaulted me. I didn't realize at the time that's what that was. That would come up years and years later.
Wow.
And I also experienced two attempted sexual assaults, one in my hometown and one in college. And so I think you and I talked about this a bit in our initial call, but sometimes I forget what I've been through. And I don't mean forget like dissociating. I've done a lot of work, but I just stop in awe and gratitude of where my life is now. And I think that's the most important message. And the if you take one thing away from this podcast, is there is hope. There is a beautiful life after childhood trauma, after sexual assault. There is a beautiful life waiting for you, and you are not alone. And there are people out here who have walked similar journeys, and there's people out here who are helping. And so, I know you'll cover resources and whatnot at the end, but just really want to make that clear. Um, and so
You.
that's a lot of trauma for one child. That's a
Yeah.
lot. And, you know, how it affected me, I think one of the most pivotal stories, which I shared on my podcast, is when my stepdad threw his briefcase at my mom. She had been standing near a freezer, and he was angry about something, and he threw that at her and literally broke her back. So I watched her drop to the floor. Um, and I don't know if people are going to watch this, but you see my skin turning red
Yeah.
as I talk about it. I can feel it. And I just want to make note, like, it's okay, because I know I'm in a safe space, but it's just evidence that our trauma lives in our bodies. And so just even talking about it, I'm starting to get flushed. I feel regulated. I feel
Right.
safe and I feel regulated, but I can feel it. And so I just I don't want to try to hide it, and I want to be honest and just help people understand that our world tries to tell us to leave our trauma in the past, and it's right here. The body keeps the score, so my body right now is questioning me. Are we safe? Is this okay? And I can sit here and do the work. And so if you catch me pausing or taking a breath, it's because the stories are still there. Um, so back to that pivotal story. I watched my mom drop to the ground. And I don't know honestly how the rest of the evening played out, but the next morning she woke me up and she said, I need you to go to the neighbor's house and I need to go to the hospital. And so I'm going to need the neighbor to take me, but I don't want you to tell her what happened. I need you to tell her that I fell down the stairs taking the dog outside. And I just remember, I think I was probably about 7 years old. And I remember walking outside and rehearsing in my head on the way to the neighbor's house, just say she fell, taking out the dog. She fell, taking out the dog. Don't talk about what happened. Don't don't say this, say this. And I was rehearsing, everything's fine, everything's fine. And that sealed in my nervous system how to put on a mask to say, everything's fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine. And so that is something I've had to spend years healing from to learn how to say, I'm hurting, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm scared. And so I did that. I went to the neighbor's house and, and that played out as my mom wanted it to. She shared, her story, which was not true about how we got there. And there were lots of stories like that. There were lots of incidences with that husband in particular. But again, I think the most important piece is to understand how that lands in our body. It solidified in my body at 7 years old, and it's still here today. It doesn't mean that I haven't had healing. It just means that every time I tell the story, I get to heal a little more if I'm in a safe space. So you are a safe space, Trish. So thank you for asking and for holding space for my stories.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for honoring and like you said, being real about the fact that you're healed. And when you look back, like, cause I feel like that as well. I'm like, wow, when I go back, but just then when you there is just if you really think about it, there's this visceral feeling, even when because they was such an imprint. But I this that was the part that when I listened to your podcast really got me. I hadn't really heard somebody else talk about that of like
Mm,
what's it like to be a child, and you for me just I felt very alone, like I had this secret and so unsafe, but like didn't know what to do because I was a kid, right? But just scared. And so listening to you speak about that and speaking about it even again, it like was an invitation for me to kind of revisit my inner child and like be like, oh yeah, that was really scary for you and kind of process through it. But the impact of that is huge to witness domestic violence as
yeah,
a child, you know.
yeah. And I was witnessing it. My stepdad at that time was physically and probably sexually abusive to my mom as well, and also sexually abusive to me. He never hit me, wasn't physically, a physical disciplinarian, if you will, but I was terrified of him. He didn't have to. He didn't have to spank me. He didn't have to physically correct me because I was always terrified. And
Yeah.
so there's this constant tension in our home. Like I wasn't allowed to walk in front of the television if there was a show on, if even if I had to go to the bathroom, I had to wait until commercial. Just these, rigid rules of control. And, what I was witnessing was terrifying. And so if you think about it, just what was imprinted in my system was terror and perfectionism, to not make a mistake, don't make the wrong step, and to say things are fine when they're not.
Yeah.
And so at 7 years old, to have that imprinted and your brain is not developed, I spent, years, decades trying to untether, well, not trying, but untethering layer by layer from the terror. I'm a worst case scenario thinker. And someone says, what's the worst that could happen? I'm like, don't ask me that. I got answers.
Yeah.
Because at 7 years old, I lived in terror. So I
Yeah.
had to be aware of my environment. And as children, we pick up on what's happening around us, whether we realize it or not. And so there was a lot that was imprinted at a very young age. And, you know, I've done a lot of healing, but for me, it's not a place of arrival. It's a lifestyle. It's a way of doing life. It's a way of embracing excuse me. It's a way of embracing my story, and just healing it layer by layer. And so when I feel, you know, the tension, when I feel, you know, my body communicating to me, I just honor that. And just, it's like I'm speaking to that inner child, like, we're okay, it's Trish.
Yeah, that you like
Yeah.
know it.
Yeah.
And that you're recognizing in your body because it's like I didn't even realize I'm like, yeah, my chest is feeling kind of hot, but
Yeah.
it's like once you can get regulated and more healed, then you can recognize it like you
Yeah.
are. Like, okay, we need to take a breath and reassure.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are lots of stories. I mean, you just heard me kind of go through the list of what I've experienced. There's lots of stories that I can tell where that doesn't happen. But again, keep in mind, this one, I was 7. That's where it started. And so I think the younger we were and the more terrifying it was, the more healing it requires, the more layers there are.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
You're fine. Well, thank you for sharing that. And what did you feel like as you were growing up, like getting into your like preteen years and kind of developing a little bit of your own self, knowing like what a relationship is, like a little bit, developmentally. How did you feel like about the world and
Wow.
partners?
That's a that's a great question. My first response would be confused, confused, maybe even disoriented,
Mhm.
because I was introduced to sexual experiences and, um, my stepdad, I remember he left out like a pornographic magazine just on the kitchen table, like it was just an everyday, you know, country living magazine. So there was predatory grooming happening. And so I was just introduced way too early. And again, I was never physically assaulted by him, and the sexual abuse was not violent. And so therefore it was very confusing. It set off things in my body that I was not ready for. And so I remember being in probably second grade, and a teacher had to correct me because I had taken my shirt. Do you remember how you can like take your shirt, twist it, and put it through the top and make it like a
Yeah.
halter top? And I
Yeah.
just thought that would be cool. Well, I was like 7 or 8 years old.
Mm.
And I remember my teacher pulling me aside saying, "Sweetie, that's not appropriate. Put your shirt back down." And I was confused, like, "Oh, okay." So confused would be the first response. And then, you know, if you consider puberty and developmental stages, everything was confusing, and I was over sexualized for sure. And so I was early to want to date boys. I was early to lose my virginity. I think I lost my virginity at 13.
Mhm.
And so everything was like fast forwarded for me. I felt like an adult at 13, 14 years old. And I wanted to be an adult. I think just because how I was conditioned.
Yeah. Like I kind of felt like felt safer to try to be an adult. But one thing I really want to honor that you shared is that, and I don't think a lot of people talk about this with childhood sexual abuse, that it's not, it's a violation, absolutely. But we have an idea that it's this very violent act and that's going to happen. And then it's going to be very clear if it happened to your child because it's like they're going to be bleeding, like, but there is this like grooming and there's like, you don't even know what sex is, right? And then you're just getting introduced to all of this stuff. And so I think it's really confusing. And I think a lot of people don't understand that that's how it can happen so often, even with strangers, because it's subtle and it's slow. Like you said, the magazine's out, they're just the talk of sex. And then it's like,
Yeah.
you don't even realize you're being violated until I would say sometimes until you're older,
Yeah.
then you can look back. But I appreciate you sharing that as well because I think that's not something I've really heard.
Yeah. That's something that I wrestled with as part of my healing journey early on was it wasn't violent, it wasn't scary, it was just what I knew. And certainly there was this is the special thing between the two of us, right? So we don't tell anybody else. And it was so manipulative, right? And at 6, 7, 8 years old, that's you don't know any different.
Right.
I did. So there was a time where we were having my cousins over, and there was a boy cousin coming to spend the night, and they gave me the talk, like you're not supposed to sleep in the same. This is my mom telling me you're not supposed to sleep in
Oh,
the same sleeping bag, and nobody's supposed to see your body except your parents and your doctor. And that was when the light bulb started to go off. It was like, well, wait a second, what about him? And then that was when the wheels started turning. And I think probably looking back, probably gave me panic attacks because of the way that I emotionally fell apart when I decided I need to tell my mom what's been happening.
oh, wow.
And I had if I was an adult behaving the way I acted when I think I was 8 when I disclosed this. And looking if I was an adult, you'd say, wow, that person's having a nervous breakdown. But I was a child on the floor, kicking, screaming, I have something to tell you. I don't want to tell you. I'm scared. Like I had come to enough knowing that this is wrong and I have to tell somebody and I'm scared to death. Because also, even though it wasn't done to me, I had seen what he was capable of. And so
Right.
I was confused and terrified. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
And so,
he didn't have to tell you, even if he didn't threaten you, you already know this person is violent and scary and
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah,
And you don't cross him.
yeah.
Right. So I was very scared. I did tell my mom, and I remember her asking me, like, just tell me what's going on. Did you break my favorite coffee mug? And I was just like, oh my gosh. And so when I told her, the first thing she said was, it's not your fault.
Oh,
So
that,
that was good.
yeah, that's good.
That eased some of my anxiety. And then I don't really remember all the details of how the day played out, but I do remember being sent to the neighbor's house. This poor neighbor, by the way, that was involved in a lot of things she probably would prefer not to have been. But I remember being sent to her house, and then I could hear the screaming and the things being thrown. We lived in there were 3 trailers at the end of a dirt road. We were the first one, and I could hear the violence happening. And I'm just talking to the neighbor like everything's fine. Because
Ending
remember,
it's
I've
not
learned
even, yeah.
I've learned how to do that. I've learned how to master that skill at 8 years old. Like, it's okay, I'm fine. And I was very adult-like in my presentation as a child. How's work? Asking an adult. I knew how to fit in with the adults better than I did kids my own age. Um, and then the police came and I didn't know what it was at the time, but he was hauled out in a straitjacket.
Okay.
And so I just remember feeling relief, like, oh, it's going to be over.
Hmm.
And the abuse stopped, but he didn't leave. He still lived with us. He was still married to my mother. She did not leave him. And so, in processing that, what happened was the terror didn't stop, but our nightly snuggles and cuddles did. And because I knew it was wrong, but yet also that was when he wasn't violent and he was nice to me, it went away. So that went away, but the terror did not.
Oh.
And my mom did not leave him until I think I was 12. So we had probably another 3 to 4 years of
Did they
living with him.
get you into any therapy or what
Oh
did your
gosh,
mom
no.
talk about anything about why he's moved?
Nobody talked
Oh,
about
okay.
anything.
So how did that make you feel when he just all of a sudden shows back up at the house? And was he gone a couple days and then he came back or
Confused.
Yeah.
and scared. And these have been themes through my life of where I feel confused about simple things. I have a hard time making decisions. One of my biggest things that I have worked on over the past 10 years is learning to trust myself. I just don't trust as you know, my knee jerk reaction, I don't trust myself. I want to reach out and ask somebody else because, again, it was imprinted in me, this confusion and this, I have to be fine. I know I'm not. I'm so confused or I'm so scared, but everything's okay. And it's confusing and disorienting. So I've had to spend a lot of time returning to myself, right? Returning to what I know, what my inner knowing is. I detached from my body for a long time. I've struggled with eating disorders, just injuries back and forth at the gym, pushing things too hard, not doing anything at all. And so it's only been in the last probably 10 years where I have a more loving relationship with my body. And still to this day, if I have a sore foot, I'm talking to my foot, I'm talking to my body. What are you trying to tell me? I trust you. You can tell me anything. And it's really connecting with those younger parts that got imprinted with so much confusion and terror.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say that that's what I have just more recently figured out, I guess, in healing trauma is just like how confused I was. I was like, that was what I really was, confused. And then when I got in different relationship, I was like, I just now that I am more healed and I see deeper layers, I'm able to see some things in a different way. I'm like, man, was I confused and terrified. Like even as an adult woman,
Yeah.
like in relationships, I was like, but at the time, I was out. I wouldn't have told you. Like I was in touch with it, right? Like I didn't
Yeah.
know. So that's
Yeah.
why I think awareness is like so important. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
And
Thank you for holding it.
and when was it that you were able to start getting some help for all of this trauma that had occurred?
So let's see. My mom divorced him when she was or when I was 12. And shocker, I ended up going to school first for law enforcement, but then shifted into social work and I
Ah,
became a social worker. And so a lot of my awareness training, I don't know that I would call it healing, but beginning to be aware was really trial by fire because I ended up working in a domestic violence shelter and then a long-term housing facility for women who had been victims of domestic violence. So I was learning and I went to school to be a social worker. So I was really like, wait, this is me? Like that happened to me. And so a lot of this was just training
wow.
by education and not having actual resources or actual therapy. I did end up running, now, mind you, prior to therapy, I ended up running a domestic violence group for men. So men who had been court ordered to take domestic violence classes. And I mean, I learned so much, but my first experience with therapy was when I was running that group. And mind you, by that point, I'd had lots of experiences as an adult as well with domestic violence and sexual assault. And I'm running this group, and I met my now husband, and we were dating.
Okay.
Prior to that, I had all kinds of numbing skills, drinking, smoking, being promiscuous, being angry. I was surviving. I didn't know it. I was surviving and I was trying to prove myself, I think, that I'm okay. And I survived this. And it's all in my own mind, in my own head. I survived this. I can help other people survive too. So it wasn't from an integrated place, it was from a logical place. It was in my head, but I hadn't really had true healing. And so when I met my now husband, who was kind and gentle, and loving and thoughtful and smart and didn't drink much and didn't do anything. It was just like quote unquote normal. And I had no idea what to do with it. Sent me into full-blown panic attacks.
Wow.
And I was like, there's gotta be something wrong with him. I'm just not finding it. Remember, I don't trust myself.
Right, right, exactly. That's the hardest thing. When you don't
Yeah,
trust yourself, then everything is very confusing. Every decision, like you said, it's like
yeah,
he looks so great. Can you trust it?
yeah.
Yeah.
And dysfunctional relationships, I knew all about. I knew how to navigate those. I knew how to duck. I knew what to say. I knew how to, you know, appease a conversation if I had to. I knew how to say everything's fine. I knew what to do in dysfunctional or toxic relationships. I had
Mm.
no idea what to do with a healthy man. And I literally had panic attacks and I had to go to the doctor and the doctor put me on medication because I was in his office like shaking and crying and he, like a general practitioner is not a psychiatrist, so that's probably not where I should have gotten my medication because I didn't know this at the time, but I was sensitive to medication. I still am. I'm very sensitive to all medications. And it sent me into a manic state.
Okay.
And so I ended up having a friend come to my house at like 10 o'clock at night and just like, what's wrong with me? Why am I was talking loud, I was talking fast, and I was freaking out. And she's like, the only thing that's changed is that medicine. Maybe you should stop taking it. Again, I was disconnected from my body. I didn't put two and two together. So it's like, oh, took another person to point that out to me. So I was so disconnected from my body and from myself. And so the next day I stopped taking the medication and started calling therapists until I found one that I felt safe with. And to a large degree, I owe my healing journey to her because that was the first time I ever sat and told anyone, aside from like, I could be drunk on a Friday night at 25 years old and be like, yeah, I was molested. It's fine. It wasn't my fault. I know as long as it wasn't my fault, I'm okay. It's just living in my
In your
head.
head. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I knew again what to say. I knew I was fine, but I really wasn't. And I had a lot of destructive behaviors. And then, so when I'm in therapy now with this, her name was Linda, I'll remember her forever. But she was the one who started pointing out all the triggers I was experiencing in the abuser group. And then also, it turns out I had a female boss who was a perpetrator. She was psychologically abusive, and I didn't realize it was happening. And it took an outsider to point out these things to me. And she also helped me with my language for my doctor, what medication I actually needed, which was something much more mild. And so she was just such a safe guide for me and really changed my life and changed the trajectory of where I was headed because I don't even think I would have stayed with my now husband um, because I didn't know what to do with him and I didn't know how to not act out and how to not be angry and push people away. And she really helped me with that. I even took him to her office. Like, here, check him. I don't trust myself. And so there was a lot of work to be done around that, but she did, and she gave her stamp of approval. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But that's so
So
healthy
that
that
be
you did that. Like you knew enough to know, like, I want a second opinion here.
Yeah. Well, I was having panic attacks and I was sure he was some form of abuser. And I started seeing, I was at the gym and I started seeing everybody was a child molester and all these, and I wasn't safe in the world. And I just knew I needed help. That was dangerous. It was like all the terror from my entire childhood that I couldn't express started coming out when I started dating my husband.
Hmm.
And so to have Linda as my guide was really just a beautiful it just I mean I could almost feel just the hard shift toward in the right direction that happened because she had language and she had ideas and she saw me and she helped me see things I couldn't see and both beautiful and toxic. She
Yeah.
helped me. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm forever grateful for Linda. Yeah.
Oh, the power of one person to really turn our life around, like you said, to ask the right questions, to witness you. And
Yeah.
that's very, very
Yeah.
powerful. And
Well, Mike was safe. My husband was safe, and that set me in a tailspin. And then she was safe, but she also knew what she was doing, and she knew
yeah.
intentionally how to hold that space. Yeah. And I got to tell the truth for the first time.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, it's huge.
Yeah. It really is. It's
It
huge.
really is. Just to be able to say what is real, what is your truth is huge for
Yeah.
stepping into healing. And when you were in some of your relationships where there was some domestic violence, were you with somebody and there was domestic violence and then you stayed and there was domestic violence again? Or because I'm wanting to just educate people a little bit about why don't women leave? Like they get
Mm,
hit or something, pushed or whatever. What you know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
what was your experience? Did that happen to you and then you didn't leave and it happened again? And
Yeah.
how?
Well, after my mom divorced my stepdad, as I was growing into my teenage years and dating, I swore I would never be with someone like my stepdad. I would never put up with that. I had all kinds of judgments. I'll never put up with that. And I experienced it more than once. And I think it's important to understand that abusers are methodical. And so typically by the time there's physical violence, you've already been psychologically manipulated and you've already lost parts or all of yourself
Yeah,
because it starts with that swooning and the honeymoon phase. And for the first time, you're like, oh my gosh, this person adores me. This person delights in me. This person protects me. And you don't realize that they're also starting to drop manipulative comments about your parents or your friends, and they're slowly pulling you away. So by the time the physical violence even starts, you've already been abused. You've already been psychologically manipulated, and probably you've already been to some extent isolated from
yeah,
your safest people, or at least you're starting to question them because he's so amazing and he's got all the dirt on all of your people and he's the only one you can trust, and all this stuff is happening. So by the time it happens, it's shock and awe, and oftentimes you have nowhere to go.
yeah. That
Like,
person is like your whole world at that
holy
point.
crap, how did I get here?
Yeah,
And then it progresses. And so my first boyfriend, it again ended up, I mean, he was a little bit older. I think I was 16, he was 18. Or maybe I was 18, he was 21. I think that's more like it. I was 18, he was 21. But he was so handsome, he was so cute, and he was so cool. And the fact that he even gave me any attention was like, ah, me? Because you look at my history, I wasn't growing up feeling confident about myself. And
yeah.
so he just said all the right things. And uh-oh,
Oh, there
my
you
camera.
go.
Okay, sorry about that. He said and did all the right things, and by the time he was abusive, it was too late. And I'll tell you, my family loved him. Everybody loved him, thought he was great because he was wonderful in public. And so, but he turned out to be just terrifying, and so abusive, just unprovoked. We're driving down the road and he'd just reach over and punch me. And then I would be shocked because it would hurt. And then he would accuse me of looking at another man in another car, or are you looking for your ex-boyfriend, that kind of stuff. And so it ended after we were at like a little bonfire out in the country, and I was wearing jewelry, and the jewelry it was mine, but it had been given to me by a boyfriend. And I didn't realize he had asked about it, and I answered, and he was upset and he left, and I'm standing up against his truck. And when he comes back, he's carrying what looked like a railroad tie. And I just see the anger in his eyes.
Mhm.
And I turned away and I ran, and he hit his own truck with that big, huge piece of wood
Wow.
and just demanded that I get rid of the jewelry. And I just ripped it off and threw it all in the fire because it was so terrifying. And so that began my attempts to leave. And I was not able to get a protective order. The laws around that at the time, and they're still not great, but the
Mhm.
laws were because we weren't married, there was nothing they could do. And I ended up going to tell my dad, my biological dad, who was a safe guy, but I hid from him my whole life because he was good and normal, and I didn't want him to know what I was wrestling with and all my issues. And but I did go and tell him I had an abusive boyfriend, and he's like, okay, well, if he wants to get to you, he's going to have to go through me and your brothers. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And then he went and met with my mom, and we all had a family meeting, and they kept me safe, and I was able to leave. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah,
That's
thank you for
really important. I
sharing
think I
that.
just want to note
Hmm.
it's really important for people to understand if you have a loved one or a friend in an obviously abusive relationship, stay open to them because a woman leaves on an average of 8 times before she's able to stay gone. And you asked, like, I want our listeners to understand why women don't leave. And
Hmm.
it's just so important to understand by the time they get the courage to leave, they've been emotionally, physically, and perhaps sexually beaten down, literally and figuratively. They've
Hmm.
been isolated away from their loved ones, away from their safe people. They know what everybody thinks about this relationship and this guy and her. And there's legit if there's kids involved, if she's been married and she hasn't worked in 10 years, there's so many reasons. And the number one thing to keep in mind is that when a woman leaves an abusive relationship, that is when she is at most risk of being murdered. And so, if you are an outsider, if you're a loved one, just keep your arms and your hearts and maybe even your homes open because there will come a time. And when it comes, she needs a place to go. And, um, there's so many reasons why women stay aside from, what I just mentioned being the biggest, but it's financial, it's the children. It's really, can you imagine being a woman having children and I'm going to leave this abusive person, but I also know I'm going to have to send my kids to him every other weekend. And
Yep.
sometimes women choose to stay for the children to make sure that they're safe.
Yeah.
And these horror stories do happen. And so I would just encourage people to study it, to read up on it, to stay open. Um, Laws have changed, services for domestic violence, survivors have changed, and there's a lot more research and a lot more support and resources to help women who are in these relationships. In past decades, it was like, let's help her get out. And now it's, let's help her stay safe, even if she chooses to stay. So we're not writing people off because we understand sometimes there isn't a good choice. And
Yeah.
sometimes the better choice is to stay in a terrible relationship. And that sounds awful, but I think as a society, we just make this assumption like, why would you put up with that? It's just not
Yeah.
that simple.
It's not. It's
And
very complex. And like you said, it looks simple if you're on the outside like that and you're in this safe thing. It's like, just call the
yeah,
police, get away. But it is very complex, especially if you do have children. And like you said, it's like women are stuck with like a lot of bad choices because it's more terrifying sometimes to think I'm going to have to leave my children because men that have perpetrated domestic violence, they don't lose custody of their children. So that
right,
woman is going to have to send their child then with
right.
somebody who's violent and they don't know, I think. So I think it's so complex. And I love what you shared about just keep staying open to that person, but and don't judge them and that they know that I'm here. Like if it's the middle of the night, you got to come to my house, that they really know they have somewhere to go. So when they get to that point that they are
Yeah,
ready to leave, um, that they know that there's just compassion and a safe place for them. And
yeah,
then some people don't even have that. And so, thankfully there's shelters and things as well. But I I feel like a lot of it times it's people that start turning their backs on that woman of like, I told her to leave, she didn't leave. So it's like kind of write her off, you know, But
Yeah.
so I love that perspective that you shared of just really stay open, don't judge. They're
Yeah.
they're in a tough spot, and when they're ready, they'll go. And the statistics on like women being murdered were quite high when I was looking them up, like in the US. Especially when someone has firearms, it's
Yeah.
like shocking to me. I mean, thousands of women are being murdered just in the US a year from domestic violence. And
Yeah.
it's just really not, to me, it's not taken seriously enough by the courts, by the society. So, and then I don't know if what statistics you have, but I was kind of surprised that I read a couple of places that said like 35% to 41% of women after age 18 have experienced domestic violence in a partnership. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know it was that high, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I was like, that's, but like you really don't, it's not something people are talking about. I know I didn't talk about it when I was going through it either, right? So it's
Right.
like, even
Yep.
knowing like we're having this conversation, people can know, hey, I'm not, because when you're in it, you feel like you're the only one and you feel dumb. Like, how am I stuck in
Yep.
this? Like,
Yep.
so it's just the power of knowing like you're not alone. This is actually happening to a lot of, unfortunately, let's change the world, right? Let's heal and
Yep.
heal the world. But right now, this is happening a lot, and then that's affecting the children, and it's the whole cycle.
It is. Yeah.
And then, um, what about what did you learn about the men? And like I said, I know women abuse men too, but I'm not minimizing that, but predominantly it's men, having violence against women. Like, what did you learn, if anything, of facilitating groups for these men? Like, did you find that there was any remorse? Like, I don't understand why men do it, really. I don't. So, um, is there anything you can say on that matter of how to
Yeah,
help men to
absolutely.
also not be, um, perpetrating this violence?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's important to note that domestic violence does not discriminate. And
Yeah.
it can happen in all socioeconomic classes. It can, there are women who are abusers, there are women who are abusive. Um, it's just that the highest percentage traditionally, typically, is men, men who identify as men who abuse women who identify as women. And
Mhm.
that's the most common. And so that's just where we're focusing our conversation. But, again, we talked about it's so easy to judge. I'm like, why doesn't she just leave him? Um, there are lots of reasons why men abuse women. It can be addiction, it can be anger issues, it can be their father was abusive, it's learned behavior. There are so many. That is the question we need to focus on instead of why doesn't she leave. I encourage everyone to start asking, why does he do this? But we don't need to go through that list, because the number one reason why men abuse women is because they can. They have the power,
Yeah.
whether it be physical, mental, socially. If someone's a police officer or a judge or a prominent doctor, they have a lot of power. Abuse is different than anger. So abusers can have anger issues, and not everyone with anger issues is an abuser, right? Like I had anger issues, but I wasn't an abuser.
Right.
But abuse is different than anger. Abuse is a misuse of power.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for
And
defining.
it's using power to control another person. Anger is you get dysregulated and you lose it for a minute. Or,
Mhm.
but if you look at most abusers, they're not getting into bar fights. They're not getting fired for their outbursts.
Right.
Usually everybody loves them.
Yes.
And they're like, and then that makes the situation complicated too, because if the community is looking at this person like, what? David? No way.
Yeah. He wouldn't do
And
that.
this, he
Great
wouldn't do
guy.
that.
Yeah.
It must be her. She's crazy. That's the other thing that people do. If a woman is
Oh,
stuck in an abusive relationship, she gets accused of being crazy. Could I just ask we stop saying that?
please.
There are
Yes.
reasons she got there, there's reasons she's there. And we as a community, as a society, need to stay open and understand that if she ever has a chance of getting out of that, we have to have places for her to go, and we have to leave our judgment behind and just be willing to be curious and understand and support and provide safety.
Yes, 100%. Thank you. That's like so well said. So
Mm,
well said.
thank
And
you.
thank you for defining that. And um, what would you say is a way, do you feel like a man can get help if he is abuser? Like if they want help, have you found that a lot of them wanted help at all? Or they're just, okay, that's kind of been my limited experience, but you have as a professional.
Yeah,
So
no.
doesn't seem like that the ones that are about control are really trying to change and get in therapy or,
Yeah. And again, this was a long time ago that I worked in the
yeah.
field, but one of the reasons, if there was an abuser, had a history of abuse, and then like when they get older, they stop, they just don't get arrested anymore. Like it's hard to judge like the recidivism rate,
Hmm.
because if when a man gets older and say he's been married for 40 years, she's not calling the police anymore. He may not be abusing her anymore. But really, the reasons are one, because he's getting older and he's tired.
Hmm.
And two, if he's with the same person who was calling the police 20 years ago, she's not acting out of line anymore. He doesn't have to. She's
Right.
so
She knows how she has to be.
trained and conditioned. She knows how to not make that happen, and she will clean up a mess before it starts.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things that abusers said in the group is, she really knows how to push my buttons. And
Ooh.
that's just victim blaming.
Yeah, that really is.
Yeah. And
Not to,
also, there are women, or I would say survivors, there are women who do push those buttons. And what the research shows is the reason they do that is because then the abuse will be more predictable. If they feel it coming on anyway, because there's this cycle that happens from like the honeymoon stage and then the ramp up and then the abuse and then
mm,
back to the honeymoon stage where the abuser's like, I'll go to church, I'll quit drinking, I'll do whatever you want, don't leave me.
yeah.
And they keep going around in this cycle. Well, the survivor, the ones that's being abused, start to pick up on that energy. They know when it's coming. And so rather than riding out a really slow, methodical storm, they will push buttons to get through it faster.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to
Yeah.
get through it, to get to the other
Let's
side.
get it over with so
That's
we can get
sad.
back to the honeymoon where you love me again.
Yeah, that's really sad.
Yeah. And keep in mind, she's been psychologically
Yeah.
damaged. She's not
It's survivor.
approaching this with logic
Yeah.
and emotional regulation, if you
Yeah.
will. Yeah.
Survive and just try to get through the
Yeah.
day. Yeah.
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 It's like, let's
Wow.
just pull the pin on the grenade and then clean it up.
Wow.
Or if she's concerned, if the aggressive attention is going towards her children, a lot of women will step in and say, and put the focus on them,
Right.
do
Right.
something to cause a disruption so that the energy gets taken away from.
Protecting her children. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
There's so much we don't understand. And as a society, there's so many reasons why these relationships continue to play out.
Yeah. And I myself want to learn more too. And I'm so grateful for you being on the podcast. I want to get this up right away because I'm saying, oh, it's October, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And then I'm like, yeah, that's good. We have awareness, but it should be all year. Like, let's not only do it in October, right? Like, let's
Yeah.
I mean, I am glad and we're going to get this out right away, but it's like just to keep talking about it and opening up the doors so people know you're not crazy. There's nothing wrong with you if you were in the situation like that, you know, not to judge yourself, and also to
Yeah.
get free when you can. And I will link some resources, of course, for people as well.
Yeah, there are hotlines where you can call and get support, free counseling. There's websites if you're safe enough to be able to use the computer. If not, if you're being watched, obviously don't do that.
Right.
Um, I would say for anyone who considers leaving to have a safety plan. And you
Mm,
can do that with a domestic violence professional. You can do that again on a hotline or at a shelter where you have a bag packed or stowed, you have a plan, so that when you have that space, you can, execute that plan, but have a professional help you set that up because there's just things that you haven't thought of, how you can be tracked, um, using your debit cards and your credit cards. So get some help. It's free. Um, and if you're not ready to leave, just love yourself and know that there are really good reasons for that. And
mm,
there are people out here willing to help who are not judging you and
mm.
will just walk with you as much as you're open to that.
Oh, thank you for that beautiful message. Yeah. Yeah. I really just my intent and my ask of the universe is like get this message to, let the women hear who need to hear it or the people,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
let them hear so they know they're not alone.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very wise advice about having a safety plan,
Yeah.
is critical. So thank you for sharing all of that. And then I know you shared about you now are with your husband and you got it and you've been on your healing journey. And what I'd like to hear a little bit about is your podcast. I love the name of, as soon as I heard the name, I was like, I love this, the work of warriors. And can you just share a little bit about your podcast? Like, how'd you come up with that name and why did you start it? And
Yeah.
I
Well,
think it's
thank you.
wonderful, but share a little bit about it for people. Like,
Sure.
what made you start it is what I really want to know too. Like,
Well, when I hit the point in my career where I realized that I was doing what a lot of people do, which is hustling through my trauma. As a therapist, I had my self-care tips, that I was practicing most of the time, but I really honestly was putting certain clients in front of my own mental health. And I really started to struggle with my own mental health. And I realized if I'm going to help people, I can't overhelp them. I have to help only the people who are ready to take this journey, that going through this process is not always fun. It's worth it. It's not always fun. It can be painful and dark. Um, and only a certain amount of people I will work with at a time. Because as a therapist, in order to feed my family, I had to work, long hours and weekends and nights. And so I just realized it's time to take care of me. And it was such a dark place, Trish, that I just committed to myself. I will never come back here. I will never abandon myself again. And I just realized how much it had been still affecting me, that I was still in some ways, even despite therapy and, all the Brene Brown, love you, Brene Brown. She saved my
oh
life too.
yes.
So I've never met her, but man, her stuff really helped change my life. But all the books I'd read, all the podcasts, whatever, I can't go back there. And so that's when I shift to a coaching perspective. I use a personality tool called the Enneagram. It's an integrative tool that helps you really it helps you connect to your story. It helps you connect to your body. It helps you connect to your brain. It's magical. And I found that was working in my therapy. And so the podcast started when I was having amazing conversations with people in the entertainment industry and with some clients who are entrepreneurs. And there was this theme of like, we are, as a society, conditioned to believe that if we just work hard enough, we'll be happy. And I had already done that. I had a successful therapy practice. I was very successful. I was making a lot of money, but I almost lost myself, literally. And
Yeah.
so I knew I wasn't alone. And so I'm like, kind of like you with this podcast, I'm like, we have to open up the conversation. And so the work of warriors came from, this idea of a warrior is like they're fighting for everyone else. But in my perspective, a warrior is someone who is taking care of themselves first so that they can take care of the rest of us. And so you don't want me helping you if I'm not well, right? And
Right.
so you want to know I am taking care of myself so that when I show up for you, I am bringing everything I have. And I'm going to help you find your transformation just as I found mine. But I was a great therapist, but I've grown so much and learned so much and healed even more from my own story that it's just more impactful. The work that I do is sometimes like a fast track through therapy because we're not just talking. And sometimes talk therapy, if you're not in if you're not working with or in touch with the trauma or working with someone who is trained in trauma, you
Mhm.
can really reactivate yourself and you can dysregulate yourself and you can harm yourself or be harmed in that therapeutic process if you don't understand how to tend to your body, which is what we call somatic work. There's somatic exercises that you can do to heal. Um, and so I just think that's, really crucial. And, that's where the work of warriors came from. So we have conversations about people who've experienced adversity, who tried to hustle their way out of it, and who went on their healing journey and they're back. And all the guests are at different places on their journey.
Mhm.
If you listen to the intro episode, I talk about, somebody maybe 4 days sober and somebody may be a coach that's had 20 years of healing. And
Mhm.
so if you're on the journey and you're, a high achiever, if you're an artist, if you're an entrepreneur, that's who we want on the show because there's lots of people in the entertainment industry who achieve a lot of things and then they get the award, they get on the stage and they
Mhm.
they realize like I'm still the same
Yeah.
and they feel disappointed all the way to they can feel suicidal because they feel like they're doing something wrong. And so the work of warriors we talk about, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just everything you want and need is within you, and
Mhm.
everything else is exterior. And while that can be fun and exciting, it can't be everything because we don't want to lose you.
Right. Yeah, we don't. And I know that you work in with high achievers in the entertainment industry, but I think just other people listening to see, I think a lot of people that are just, I don't know, just not in that industry think, oh, they've got the car, they've got the house, the success. Like, if only I had that, like I'd be really happy. So I think people sharing how much like no, when they got there, that was really empty if they were trying to get there from a place of trauma or whatever, thinking this will
Yeah.
make me happy. And
Yeah.
it won't. Like you said, it's like an internal thing that we've got to deal with
Yeah.
ourselves. And
Yeah.
so I
And
think that's
so
a
many
powerful
people
message.
ask me like why the entertainment industry? Why did you pick that niche?
Yeah.
I didn't just pick it. I have a son who's an actor and a filmmaker, and I've
Oh, okay.
spent 18 years, or like he didn't start when he was a baby, but 10 years keeping him safe, being afraid of the industry. I grew up in the 80s,
Mhm.
making a lot of friends along the way, but also the entertainment industry is the one voice that says if you just have to be somebody,
Right.
right? And I think we have a young generation of people growing up, trying to be TikTok famous, if you will.
Mhm.
Everybody's trying to go viral. Talk to anybody who's gone viral and ask them what that's actually like, because it's not as fun as you think it is. And it
Mhm.
can be devastating. And you are opening yourself up to everybody's voice. And if you're not ready, it really runs the risk of taking you out. But we have this idea that if you're viral or if you go viral, if you're famous or if people know your name, then you're going to be happy. And again, that's not true. And so I am really passionate because let's just talk about for a second celebrity suicide, which is really my main mission is to end celebrity suicide.
Mhm.
Because if somebody who seemingly has it all, they have the career, everybody knows them, they have a ton of money, they have the lifestyle, the fun, all these things, and they leave, they
Mhm.
die by suicide. What does that say to somebody who's struggling and they're 33 and they're living, they don't think they've made it yet, or that, you know what I mean? Like they haven't arrived in where they think they should be. It causes other people to lose hope. And even though we don't know them, we love our celebrities, we love our famous people.
Right.
And when they can't make it, I think it robs us of hope. And so that's another really important reason to focus on the entertainment industry. And we're starting to see small shifts. And it couldn't be happier, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing the work and uh, on yourself so that you could be here and that you could create this and coach others. I mean, it's that you really
Yeah.
transformed to the point that you can share also to help other survivors. So I really appreciate that. And let people know how they could reach you. I'm going to link everything. I just want to say I love that you have your podcast on YouTube because I like watching my podcasts. So, but I'll link that, but also, yeah, share where other places people can find you. I know you've got a website and
Yeah, my website is everything is my name, so kimrapach.com. And I'm on Instagram, and Facebook is more personal. There's not much there unless you want to see my dogs. I post a lot about my dogs. But the Work of Warriors podcast is on all the podcast platforms, Spotify and Apple, and like you mentioned, YouTube if you prefer to watch. And then I don't know if I said LinkedIn, but I'm on LinkedIn there too.
too.
And yeah,
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'll put all the links down below so people can connect with you and check it all out.
thank you. Yeah, just reach out. I'm happy to answer questions or steer you in the right direction for whatever, resource you might need. As a social worker, I'm like the queen of resources. If I can't help you, I know somebody who can
You know
help
someone who
at
can.
least
Yeah.
steer you in the right direction. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. And thank you
Yeah.
again for being here today. It's been an honor to have you as a guest. And
Well, thank you for having me, Trish.
yeah. Okay. Bye. Oh, let
Bye.
me